All right, time to go teach. Hello and welcome to this episode of Tutors, where we are continuing our unit on evolution, and today we are looking at some other mechanisms for evolution. Natural selection was the mechanism for evolution that we looked at in the past couple episodes, and today we're going to look at a couple other mechanisms for evolution. So, moving on. First thing that we are going to do today is we are going to describe one mechanism, which is called genetic drift. What takes place in genetic drift, how does genetic drift occur, and what impact that will have on a population. And then we are going to explain sexual selection, which also is another mechanism for evolution. And at the end, we are going to compare and contrast our different mechanisms for evolution, what factors are involved, and how they end up causing organisms to change over time. So first, genetic drift. What is it? Well, first off, it's not necessarily based on fitness. Unlike natural selection, where some organisms are going to outcompete other organisms, genetic drift is not based upon one factor or one specific allele being a favorable allele. It's not about a phenotype being better than another phenotype. It ends up being much more random than that, and it's based upon migration or some sort of disaster. The two different examples that we're going to look at are the founder effect and the bottleneck effect. The founder effect is due to migration, and the bottleneck effect is due to some random disaster that is going to cause a lot of organisms to die. The founder effect works where we have a small group which is going to leave the original population. And when it leaves the original population, the issue is the allele frequency within that small group probably does not exactly match the allelic frequency in the main group because it's a small subset of our main population. And since it's a small subset, it's much easier for that population to have a slightly different allelic frequency, which means when they reproduce and as that population increases, this new population is going to have a different allelic frequency than the original population from which they came from. But this population's change in allelic frequency is not due to some natural selective event. It only happened because a group of those organisms were able to leave and they were able to survive. An example of this would be if we had foxes and two foxes were to leave this population and start a population of foxes in a new area. When these two foxes reproduce, they could end up causing a population that looks like this, which is very different from our original population. Our original population mostly had black-tailed foxes. But this new population is 50% black-tailed foxes and 50% white-tailed foxes. That's because the organisms that left the original population, their allelic frequencies did not exactly match with the main population's allelic frequencies. A population bottleneck is a little bit different. Instead of having a group of organisms leave and start in a new area, in a population bottleneck, it's that a bunch of organisms are going to die. There is some sort of horrible disaster which is going to wipe out the vast majority of that population. The organisms that survive are going to replenish the population. But because so many organisms have died, the variation within that population has been drastically reduced. This could be due to a meteor hitting the Earth, wiping out a large group of organisms. There is no allele that they could have had that would have saved them from that specific impact. Or it could have been due to an ice age. There's no phenotype that any of the organisms had that would have saved them from dying by that specific disaster. The only reason some organisms survived was due to just random chance. This was not due to them having specific alleles that made them more fit. It's more that they happened to live in a specific area that wasn't as devastated as another area. If we think about it, we can look at the original allelic frequency as being like a kaleidoscope of colors, all this different variation. And in a population bottleneck, the vast majority of those die out. Our new allelic frequencies have almost no variation at all. The alleles have disappeared from these populations because, unfortunately, due to the disaster, they were mostly wiped out. This has specifically happened with cheetahs. Cheetahs are basically all related. It doesn't matter where in Africa you would go to. Cheetahs have had 2 population bottleneck events, which now means that the variation between different cheetahs is so small they are essentially of the same exact family. The entire population of cheetahs have a very limited amount of variation due to so many of their population being wiped out at different times. When the majority of the cheetah population died out, the allelic variation disappeared as well. Sexual selection is a little bit different. In sexual selection, it's where the mates are going to have a preference for a specific trait. The mates are going to choose a specific trait that they find to be attractive, that they are going to have a preference for. This could be due to the way that the mate looks. This could be due to the way that the mate dances. This could be due to the way the mate sings a song or the way that the mate is able to build a nest. There are different things that are going to cause one organism to choose its mate. But that specific choosing is going to mean that the organisms that have done the correct dance or that look the specific way, they are able to have offspring, which they are then passing their alleles to. And the organisms that are unable to fulfill that role or unable to attract a mate, they are unable to pass on their alleles, and that means that their alleles will disappear. This leads to something called sexual dimorphism. Sexual dimorphism is when males and females of a specific species look different. The males are going to have specific characteristics that set them apart from the females, and the females will also have specific characteristics that set them apart from the males. Many times, it's where the males are going to look flashy or bright, or they are going to have certain colors to draw attention to themselves because they are trying to attract a mate. The females, on the other hand, don't typically have the same bright coloration because the females are the ones that are choosing the mate. And this leads to some very interesting things because we wouldn't anticipate that a long, heavy tail would be beneficial to the peacock. But because that is how the peacock attracts its mate, it ends up that the peacocks with longer and larger and more colorful tails end up having offspring, and the peacocks with smaller, less colorful tails do not actually have offspring and are favored against. Even though having a smaller tail might help a peacock get away from a predator, it doesn't help the peacock find a mate, which is extremely important when it comes to passing on your genes. The mechanisms then are natural selection, genetic drift, and sexual selection. Those are the 3 main ways that we can think about for the mechanisms for evolution. It is either through nature changing and the fittest, the organisms that fit that environment the best, survive. Or it's due to some random chance of either migration or based upon some random disaster that wipes out a large amount of a population, decreasing the allelic variation within that population. Or it's due to sexual selection, where you have non-random mating occurring, where the organisms are going to choose which traits are going to be favored and which traits are not favored, based upon which organisms are going to be able to reproduce and which organisms are not going to be able to reproduce, based upon mate choice. So in summary of all this, there are many ways that the allelic frequencies can change. First, the allelic frequencies can change through mutation. When a mutation occurs and forms a new allele, that is going to change our allele frequency. Or the allele frequency can change through natural selection, allowing for some organisms to outcompete other organisms, or it could be just through genetic drift, where some organisms either migrate to a new area or the vast majority of the population gets wiped out through some specific disaster, or it could be through sexual selection. The key is that those factors that can cause the allele frequencies to change, those are all mechanisms for evolution. Until next time, be awesome, stay awesome.